For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. In the heart of the untamed backcountry, where the echoes of civilization fade and the vastness of nature stretches before you, you find yourself in a unique crucible of self-discovery and resilience. Stranded amidst the rugged beauty, remember that within you lies a wellspring of strength and adaptability waiting to be unearthed. As you navigate the challenges of survival, each obstacle becomes a canvas upon which you can paint your ingenuity and determination. Amidst the dense jungle foliage, where eerie creatures wander, and upon the vast seas, with only the undulating horizon in sight, you stand on the brink of mortality. Though uncertainty may surround you, let it be a catalyst for the discovery of your own untapped potential. Your footsteps on this path through the wild become a testament to your perseverance, leaving a mark not just on the land, but also on the landscape of your own soul. Embrace the challenges as opportunities and let the solitude be your guide to introspection. In these moments, you have the chance to reevaluate your purpose, your priorities, and your aspirations. When you finally emerge from the wilderness, you'll carry not just the stories of survival, but also a newfound appreciation for the simple wonders of life. So let the wilderness be both your teacher and your sanctuary. Draw strength from the wild and let it infuse you with the wisdom of the ages. The following stories embody the true horror of being stranded and the remarkable resilience required to conquer these trials. Remember, you are not just stranded, you are embarking on a transformative journey of self-discovery, where the wilderness becomes the crucible in which your spirit is forged anew. Please click the subscribe and like buttons. This is the Outdoor Disasters Stranded Marathon. For Yossi Ginsberg and Kevin Gale, their Amazon expedition would be treacherous. Yossi Ginsberg, 22, concluded his military training with the Israeli Defense Forces. Driven by a thirst for adventure and a belief in boundless possibilities, he was eager to explore the world. In the 1970s, Yossi's ambition grew after briefly returning from a journey through Africa and Mexico. Yossi took on various jobs to amass funds for his South American expedition. Towards the end of 1981, Yossi hitchhiked his way from Venezuela to Colombia and subsequently to Bolivia. During his travels, he crossed paths with Marcus Stam, hailing from Schaffhausen, Switzerland. The two formed a strong bond, with Marcus being a well-regarded primary school teacher and accomplished tennis player. Marcus was navigating personal turmoil due to his recent separation from his longtime girlfriend who had accompanied him to South America. Yossi and Marcus ventured to La Paz, Bolivia, which is the world's highest capital city, situated at an elevation of 3,650 meters or 11,975 feet above sea level. In La Paz, their paths crossed with Karl Ruprechter, an Austrian who presented himself as a geologist. Karl disclosed his plans to Yossi about an upcoming expedition into the uncharted regions of the Bolivian Amazon. Their goal was to locate gold within a remote indigenous Takana village. Ruprechter shared tales of his visits to an ancient indigenous village nestled deep within the Bolivian rainforest. This village was home to a seldom encountered indigenous tribe whose interactions with white men had been rare. Within these stories lay alluring accounts of gold and wealth. Yossi successfully convinced Kevin Gale, an American photographer hailing from Oregon and a fellow traveler they had encountered, to accompany them on their journey. Although Kevin had initially intended to fly back to the U.S. for Thanksgiving, he altered his plans to come back for Christmas instead. Ginsberg, Gale, and Stam shadowed Ruprechter's path, taking a plane to Apollo from La Paz. From Apollo, they embarked on a journey downstream along the Tuichi River, reaching a village named Asariamas, situated where the Tuichi and Asariamas rivers converged. Subsequently, the team commenced their expedition by ascending the Asariamas River and traversing mountains en route to Ruprechter's legendary objective, enticed by the allure of gold. Having stashed provisions in their backpacks, the quartet delved into the heart of the Bolivian jungle, distancing themselves from civilization as Karl led the expedition. The surrounding terrain teemed with an array of creatures, birds, monkeys, spiders, snakes, and insects, contributing to a vibrant ecosystem. Carl laid out their sustenance strategy. They would rely solely on rice, beans, and salt, relying on the jungle's resources to secure food. Yossi's reflection on the moment Carl hunted a monkey captured the scene vividly. It was a gruesome sight, with the wildness of the jungle reflected in his gaze. For several days, they trekked onward, but dwindling food supplies caught up with them unexpectedly, since Yossi, Marcus, and Kevin had anticipated reaching their destination within a short span. As resources grew scarce, they found themselves compelled to consume monkeys. However, Stam declined to partake, leading to a gradual decline in his physical strength. Additionally, he suffered from trench foot, a fungal infection, rendering him incapable of keeping pace with his companions. Despite expressing immense pain after a week, his fellow travelers remained skeptical due to his persistent complaints. Yossi conveyed, "Perpetual hunger plagued us. We'd traverse extended distances on empty stomachs. We hunted monkeys, resorting to their meat. My hunger was such that I would have ingested anything. Even human flesh wouldn't have been refused in those conditions. Extreme hunger strips away all disgust." Recognizing Marcus's inability to continue, the quartet made a tough choice to abort their journey, retracing their steps to Asariamus. Retracing their route to the Tuichi River, disappointment arose in Kevin and Yossi, for their aspirations had been shattered. They held Marcus responsible, attributing their predicament to his reluctance to consume the wild game. Upon returning to the village of Asariamus, Carl introduced a fresh plan to his companions. His idea was to navigate the Tuichi River on a raft, reaching a small gold quarry called Kuriplaya, nestled on the riverbed. From there, they aimed to journey downstream to Rurenabak, positioned near the Beni River, and then return to La Paz. With the aid of the villagers, they constructed a raft and embarked on their downriver expedition, eventually reaching the point where the Tuichi and Ipurama rivers converged. At this juncture, Carl Ruprechter warned them of challenging rapids within the San Pedro Canyon, unsuitable for raft traversal. Adding to this, he confessed an inability to swim and refused to proceed on water. Yossi recounted, "On the raft, Carl argued vehemently despite his lack of rafting knowledge. Cooperation was absent, friendship strained, everything felt like a torment." In response, Kevin Gale and Yossi Ginsberg determined to continue their rafting venture towards Rurenabak. Meanwhile, Carl Ruprechter and Marcus Stam opted for an alternative route, choosing to hike along the Ipurama River to reach the Ipurama village near the river's source. They planned to return to Apollo subsequently. The quartet agreed to regroup in La Paz prior to Christmas. Carl asserted that survival necessitated walking, while Kevin remained steadfast in adhering to their original strategy, circumventing the San Pedro Falls, constructing a new raft, and resuming their river-bound journey. Although Yossi was inclined to accompany Carl and Marcus, his connection with Kevin influenced his decision to join the rafting endeavor. Yossi harbored concerns about the group's cohesion, desiring their collective emergence. Marcus, on the other hand, was disheartened by the prospect of being left behind with Carl on foot. In hindsight, the decision to split the group in the midst of the jungle was undeniably reckless. While theoretically Carl and Marcus would require a week to trek out, they vanished without a trace, leaving their fate unknown. Approaching the waterfall within the confines of the San Pedro Canyon on their makeshift raft, Kevin and Yossi confronted a maelstrom of furious rapids that ultimately tore them apart. The river's channel was narrow with a swift current. In anticipation of the tumultuous white water, both men positioned themselves prone on the raft, but their efforts proved futile as they collided with a substantial rock. This collision resulted in their ejection from the raft into the water. Kevin managed to reach the riverbank unscathed, while Yossi's course led him downstream, culminating in his passage over the cascading waterfall. Exerting tremendous effort, Yossi tenaciously kept himself afloat until the water's turbulence subsided. Subsequently, he swam ashore, only to confront the stark reality of his isolation, a combination of hunger, fatigue, and apprehension. In an incredible stroke of luck, he stumbled upon his backpack containing essential supplies. These provisions would later become indispensable for his survival in the jungle. Meanwhile, Kevin Gale found himself in a dire situation with minimal sustenance available. Searching for sustenance, he resorted to scavenging bird eggs from nests and using his machete to catch small animals. As time passed, a sense of increasing frailty enveloped him. Despite his efforts to conserve energy, he struggled to find suitable shelter and warmth during the nights. By the fifth day, excruciating pain in his feet, accompanied by oozing pus from his missteps, rendered him almost immobile, making walking an unbearable ordeal. Realizing the urgency of the situation and the need to facilitate healing, Kevin understood that he had to alleviate the strain on his feet. The only apparent option was to navigate downstream on the river, even though the prospect held its own set of risks. Lacking the strength to construct a raft, he improvised by locating a fallen tree trunk. With this makeshift vessel, he allowed the current to carry him along the water's course, which was swift and unforgiving. The pressing reality was that unless he escaped the jungle's clutches soon, his survival hung in the balance. A glimmer of hope emerged as Kevin Gale's eyes met an astonishing sight. Two indigenous Indians traversing the opposite riverbank in single file, one of them shouldering a rifle. Fueled by desperation, he shouted towards them in Spanish, his voice carrying the plea, "Ayúdame, ayúdame," which means help me. "I can't walk and I'm lost," he shouted. Gratitude overwhelmed him as the two Indians responded swiftly, grabbing hold of the tree trunk and guiding him to safety on the shore. It was a revelation that they hailed from the very village, San Jose, that Kevin had been tirelessly searching for, offering a lifeline when all seemed lost. After enduring 5 days adrift on a log in the river, Kevin was rescued. Following his rescue, he made his way back to La Paz. Upon his return, he sought assistance from both the Israeli and Austrian consulates, urging them to initiate search and rescue operations for the absent individuals. Shockingly, the authorities at the Austrian consulate revealed that Ruprechter was, in fact, a fugitive with an Interpol warrant, discrediting his claims of being a geologist. Yossi found himself lost without any supplies or gear. His store of rice was quickly depleted, although he managed to locate berries and fruits within the forest occasionally. He resorted to foraging eggs from nests, and even seized an opportunity to consume a monkey that had fallen from a tree. He encountered aggressive wild boars, remained under the constant threat of venomous snakes, and endured bites from termites. Yossi recalled, "Undoubtedly the nights were the most harrowing. As nightfall descended, darkness enveloped everything, the heavens concealed. The darkness was suffocating, as dense as velvet. In the nocturnal hours, a cacophony of sounds emerged, screeches, roars, barks, and calls. The landscape was alive, unnervingly so. I lacked both fire and a weapon to shield myself. If not for my ability to drift into daydreams, I would have been devoured by the horrors of these nights." On one occasion, Yossi awoke to rustling sounds, only to find himself face to face with a jaguar. Drawing from a scene in a James Bond movie, he improvised a makeshift flamethrower using mosquito repellent and a lighter. He shared, "I picked up the trick from a James Bond movie." Amidst these challenges, the most excruciating experience was the relentless wear and tear on Yossi's feet as he traversed day after day, hoping to reach the nearest settlement. His feet became so infected that the skin and flesh peeled away, leaving behind bloody, fleshy stumps. Yossi recounted, "They were raw chunks of exposed flesh. The pain was unbearable. In desperation, I crawled to a tree infested with fire ants, shaking them onto my body. The waves of pain and adrenaline served as a distraction from the agony in my feet. Further horrors awaited him, including the discovery of worms embedded under his skin and an incident where he impaled his rectum on a jagged stick after sliding down a muddy slope. One morning, Yossi awoke to aching pains coursing through his body, only to realize that he had spent the night resting atop a termite nest. On the 17th day of his ordeal, an airplane soared overhead, yet its occupants remained oblivious to his presence on the ground. The dense jungle canopy effectively concealed anyone situated below. Reflecting on this occurrence, Yossi recounted, "The plane's passage shattered me. The surge of hope it ignited was ironically the most devastating moment for me." Yossi found himself in the mud, sobbing and contemplating ending his own life. In that moment of despair, he raised his gaze and perceived what appeared to be a girl. He shared, "For 2 days I found solace in the company of a girl. She manifested beside me, whether a product of my imagination or not. Her presence was a miracle of sorts, as it coincided with the very instant when I had relinquished all hope. She arrived at the moment of my deepest surrender. We conversed incessantly. Though her replies were absent, I constructed a camp for both of us, creating a space for her to sleep beside me. Yet, as swiftly as she had arrived, the girl disappeared one night." Yossi's recollection of the experience continued. I reached out to embrace her, only to realize her absence. Panic seized me, for if she was gone, it implied my own madness. Fear gripped me, and I struggled to articulate the phenomenon. Perhaps my subconscious had conjured her? Yossi held a conviction that the girl played a pivotal role in saving his life because she depended on him. He noted, "This taps into a profound aspect of human nature. We often go to greater lengths to save another's life than our own." As I had reached a point where self-help was futile, it felt like the end. However, her presence suddenly burdened me with responsibility. Yossi also narrowly escaped drowning 2 times during a severe storm that struck the region, said to be the most intense in a decade. He recounted, "In the second swamp I fell into, I couldn't extract myself. Suicidal thoughts crossed my mind, yet I reasoned that if I had intended to end my life, I should have done so within the initial days. After struggling for 19 days, I was resolute that my life would not be extinguished then. Then the impossible happened. Upon hearing the sound of an engine, Yossi returned to the nearby river and collapsed." Yossi recalled, "It is very difficult to see it as a coincidence. Kevin had found his way back to safety, and he came with some Bolivians on a boat to find me. They had given up hope, but could not find anywhere to turn the boat around. They were forced upstream to land the boat in the whole of the Amazon. The place they landed happened to be the place where I had collapsed unconscious. A boat guided by a burly riverman named Tico Tudela. Leaning over the bow, calling Yossi's name, was his friend Kevin. He was rescued. Nearby, indigenous people organized a search and rescue mission led by Tudela. They found Ginsberg 3 days into their search, 3 weeks after he was first declared missing, and close to the search being abandoned. Tico and Kevin carried the emaciated castaway downriver to Rurenabak. He spent the 3 months following his rescue recovering in a hospital. Ruprechter and Stam vanished without a trace, and all attempts by Kevin and Yossi in various search and rescue missions yielded no results. There were no indications of campfires, human waste, or signs of animal activity in the area. The fate of the 2 men remains an enigma. Yossi, in his book, speculated that they might have been victims of a falling tree during a storm, or that Ruprechter's accident led to both their deaths, as Marcus wouldn't have been able to navigate the jungle on his own. After returning to Israel, Ginsberg authored a captivating book recounting his remarkable journey titled Back from Tuichi. A decade later, Yossi ventured back to the Amazon to support the locals who had aided him in San Jose de Uchupiamonas. Faced with the challenge of preserving their way of life amidst significant changes, Yossi found inspiration to establish an eco-lodge. The Amazon experiences left an indelible mark on Yossi, shaping his approach to the world and its challenges. His time in the jungle taught him that incredible feats are within reach if we embrace new ideas, adapt to change, and maintain an optimistic outlook in uncertain circumstances. These insights evolved into a guiding business philosophy that he shares, motivating others to confront challenges with resilience and an open mind. Ultimately, his rainforest encounter altered his life profoundly. "I became a very simple person. The simple things are the most precious to me. I don't ascribe much significance to the things I have now. That feeling of touching death has never left me." For Alex Lofgren and Emily Henkel, the extremes of the park will show to be hard to overcome. Lofgren and Henkel, both experienced campers, set off for Death Valley with jugs of water, camping gear, and at least 1 day's worth of food. On April 3, 2021, the couple left Helendale, California, for a routine camping trip in Death Valley. The next day began the biggest nightmare of their lives. Alex was known for camping in remote areas, and Emily grew to love the excursions with her boyfriend. The couple left in the morning with the goal to experience the popular destinations the park has to offer and camping later that night. Alex and Emily's camping excursions usually consist of an approximate area they would like to camp, not a specific campground. Earlier, a park ranger suggested an area that required traveling on a backcountry road, which ended up being Gold Valley Road, an unpaved 4-wheel drive road that cuts a solitary path through the backcountry of the park. They were driving a Subaru Forester, an automobile built for rugged terrain, so there was little concern that the vehicle couldn't handle the road. Around 5:30 p.m. on April 3rd, 2021, as they were driving, they heard two loud pops. Emily's heart dropped. They got out of the Subaru and found that the two passenger side tires were punctured by a rock in the road. With only one spare tire, Alex and Emily were stranded in a very remote section of Death Valley, and 22 miles from a main road with no cell phone service. No shade or water in sight. There was nothing of benefit for them to survive. Survival mode kicked in for the couple. They spent the remainder of the evening plotting their escape. Alex and Emily always came prepared for the most part, so they used maps and books to devise a plan for tomorrow. They packed a day pack, liters of water and a couple of bags of tuna each, a survival kit, and anything else of use to prepare for tomorrow's trek. They fell asleep in the Subaru, knowing they needed all the rest they could get for the important day. Alex and Emily woke up at 4 a.m. the next day. The couple decided against hiking the 22 miles they just traveled. Instead, they chose to trek toward Mormon Point. The route they chose was through a mountain pass on a designated trail, with the hope that help would be close by. The path required crossing through a canyon with steep drops. They left a note in the car stating, "Two flat tires headed to Mormon Point, have 3 days worth of water." They fortified the Subaru with many indications they were stranded and laid rocks on the ground in the shape of an arrow, pointing to the direction they were traveling. In the darkness of the desert, they proceed on their mission. The moon was extremely bright that early morning. They knew they were on a life-and-death mission, but at this moment, it felt like any other hike, and were still able to enjoy the scenery Death Valley has to offer. As they reached the trail, Alex gathered some rocks and made another arrow pointing to the direction of their trek. Around 8 a.m., they spotted a geocache, a container containing a logbook, and trade items that can be found on hiking trails. This gave the couple some semblance of hope, knowing the trail is well traveled. They continued down the trail where the difficulty of the trail increases into a slot canyon. Huge rock walls towered over them. The terrain was rocky. In the geocache logbook, someone mentioned a 70-foot waterfall close by. A mile down the path, they reached the waterfall but had a dire realization. There was no easy way down. As they look over the ledge, it was a solid drop down. This was an established climbing route that required rope and harnesses, something obviously they did not have. They looked around to see if there was any other way down. Unfortunately, there wasn't. It was here they made the decision to forge on. Alex looked to see if there were any boulders that made natural steps down the cliff. Alex proceeded to climb down with Emily nervously looking on, saying, "No unnecessary risks. One step at a time. Take it easy. Be careful." Alex works his way down the cliff, but he comes to a standstill. Alex yells, "Can't find a way down. I'm going to work myself back up." As he climbs up, Alex yells, "I lost my grip." "What do you mean you lost your grip?" Emily yells. Emily knew this was not going to end well. She looked for anything around to help him up. Moments later, he fully loses his grip. He falls 70 feet down the waterfall as Emily looks on horrified. She was beside herself. She didn't know what to do. By some miracle, he was still alive. He yelled to Emily to get help. She made a quick and possibly deathly decision. A few minutes prior to the fall, she had seen a potential way down. Alex fell down the right side of the canyon. On the left side, there was a body crack in the rock. It was very steep, but she knew that was her only way down. She knew her life was at risk, but she had to be down there with Alex. Emily manages to get to the left side of the canyon. Her arms gripping both sides of the crack, she makes her way down. About halfway down, there was nowhere else for her to grab on to climb down, with approximately 30 feet left to reach the ground. She drops her backpack in hopes it would break her fall. Emily lets go. She lands on her feet. She snaps her ankle in half. She gets up to do a checkup on herself. To her amazement, the ankle was the only injury she suffered. With adrenaline numbing the pain, her only concern was Alex. Emily makes her way to him. Alex succumbed to his injuries. Alex passed away on Easter Sunday, April 4th, 2021. But Emily was in a dire situation. With her boyfriend deceased, Emily somehow had to gather herself and access the situation. To her despair, she realizes they have fallen onto a cliff midway down. There was another 100-foot drop off the ledge of the cliff. Even without a broken ankle, there was no way out. The day was filled with feelings of despair, guilt, horror, and what-ifs. But she knew these feelings were not going to lift her out of this dire situation. When she woke up the next day, to her dismay, what had happened wasn't a nightmare. This was still real. Her boyfriend was dead, and she was trapped alone on a ledge in a slot canyon with no way out. She gathered herself and took stock of what she had to survive. She had water and food they packed the night before. Fortunately, they also packed a survival kit which consisted of a Mylar emergency blanket. She managed to build some shelter in the form of stacking rocks that covered her face and upper body. Emily had packed a solar charger, which allowed her to keep her phone charged for the entirety of the ordeal. This allowed her to jot down the thoughts she had. She knew she was at the mercy of the search and rescue teams. But she had hope and wrote every day that they will get out. They will be rescued. But there was part of her that knew the chance of rescue was slim. This was such a remote and desolate place. It was hard to fathom that someone would find them. Although she was in a shaded canyon, she was trapped in one of the hottest places on Earth with Alex's body nearby. Every day around 1:30 p.m., the sun peeked through the canyon and was more vulnerable to sunburn and dehydration. Fortunately, she found a little nook on the ledge that provided some shelter from the direct sunlight for the next 4 hours until the sun moved past the canyon chasm. An hour before the unbearable sun peeked its ugly head, there was a checklist of things she needed to do to make it through the day. The most important item on the to-do list was to make it through the hottest part of the day. The waterfall was more like a running stream and was a vital lifeline. She directed the stream and made a small dam where she could soak her towel and clothes in an attempt to keep her body temperature down. The Mylar blanket was not only useful for keeping her warm at night, but was shade from the sun as well. The blanket was fragile and kept ripping, so she used Band-Aids from the survival kit to keep it together. She spent nearly an hour every day repairing the blanket. She had to keep the blanket intact. Next to food and water, it would be her most valuable item, and it would provide more value as the days go on. Back in civilization, news of the missing couple reached nationwide, and search and rescue teams scoured Death Valley National Park for days. On Wednesday, April 7, 2021, the entire Death Valley Highway was searched, and every monument and attraction along the route was checked. Alex had entered a backcountry registration log, listing their destinations while they were in the park, and each was checked to no avail. By the time authorities found their car in a remote stretch of the park on Gold Valley Road, the couple had been missing for 4 days. Inside the abandoned white Subaru, the note stating their destination was found. The April 8th discovery marked a turning point in the desperate search for Alex and Emily. They knew where to look for them. It was on this day early in the morning that Emily heard the helicopter propellers in a distance. Emily's mind races. She knew this was it. She sees the helicopter pass over her. It didn't see her. Then she heard the propellers again, and it was louder. She waves the Mylar blanket. The helicopter spots it. At last, Emily and the body of Alex were found. The helicopter leaves to Emily's bewilderment, but she knew she was spotted. 1 hour passed, and another hour, and another. At this point, her old nemesis, the Death Valley sun, is looming. So with great disappointment, she returns to the routine she had become accustomed to the past few days. Soak the towel, soak the clothes, sit in the nook on the ledge to hide from the sun. Around 7:30 p.m., Emily is awakened by a similar sound, but on a smaller scale. A bright light beams down at her. A drone was sent to communicate with Emily. She was annoyed at this point and had to endure for another night. The next day, she was hopeful to finally be rescued. She heard the propellers again, this time from Navy Search and Rescue. Rescuers initially attempted a hoist operation to reach the couple, but 2 team members who rappelled down were not able to reach them due to the extreme location. The canyon was narrow, and the wind from the propellers made it a complicated rescue. Finally, after 20 minutes of attempting to rappel, they reached Emily. They strap her into the rescue stretcher and lift her out of the canyon. Emily closes her eyes as she's being lifted up. She couldn't bear to watch. After a little while, she takes a peek and looks around. All she could see is the vast nothingness of beige rocks under her. She couldn't believe how they found her. Emily was transported to a hospital for emergency surgery. She stayed for 6 days. Fortunately, the decision she made to keep her shoes on to prevent the swelling from her broken ankle saved her foot. Shortly after, she returned to her hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. After serving in the United States Marine Corps and deploying to Afghanistan in 2011, He was medically discharged after 4 years of honorable service. Alex Lofgren received a bachelor's degree in political science from Arizona State University. He joined the district office of Reverend Raul M. Grijalva in 2019 as part of the Wounded Warrior Fellowship Program. He was a caseworker on a crisis line helping veterans in immediate need at the time. Alex and Emily met when she traveled to Arizona for a 1-year volunteer commitment through the AmeriCorps Vista program. She was placed with a nonprofit organization that worked to provide education and resources to employers across the state of Arizona to serve veterans. Alex was incredibly passionate about everything he did, especially when it came to helping veterans on a local, state, and eventually federal level. I always thought he was precisely the missing piece they needed to get things done among the decision makers, with his stubborn and strong-willed attitude, ready to tackle any challenge presented before him. He had a flight scheduled to Washington, D.C., 2 weeks after our Death Valley trip for that exact reason, to meet those that would mentor him, the world his oyster. Not being able to see what accomplishments he would have made will forever remain on my extensive list of what-ifs, Emily stated. Alex's livelihood was making sure every veteran lived the life they deserve by whatever means he could provide. He also understood the healing powers of nature and made efforts to have veterans experience the outdoors. Emily felt a calling to make sure his efforts never end, and now is the president of a nonprofit organization, Veterans in Parks. Not long after the ordeal, Emily learned of his former employer, Congressman Raul Grijalva, that the Alexander Lofgren Veterans in Parks Act was in the works. If signed into law, this act would allow all service members, veterans, and Gold Star families access to national parks and lands for free, for life. On December 27, 2021, it was officially signed into law only 8 months after his tragic passing. His legacy lives on. In October 2010, 3 teens from Tokelau would find out how dangerous and remote these waters can be. Etweni Nassau, 14, Samu Palesa, 15, and Philo Philo, 15, drifted 300 kilometers across an empty and little-traveled section of the Pacific Ocean. It began, in the grand tradition of ill-considered ideas, with a group of boys and a bottle of booze. The boys were gathered in their clubhouse near the end of the only road in the only village on the Pacific island of Atafu. Atafu is one of 3 atolls that make up the nation of Tokelau. The total amount of land on Atafu is 1.4 square miles, population 524. The nearest atoll, equally tiny, is 57 miles to the south, well beyond the range of visibility. The closest significant landmass is Samoa, a 28-hour ferry ride away. There is no landing strip on Tokelau. There are also no dogs, prisons, lawyers, pavement, or soil. The land is mostly bits of broken coral. The highest elevation is 15 feet. Coconuts and fish are the traditional diet. From any point on Atafu's shoreline, nothing can be seen but water, all the way to the horizon. They were drinking vodka, smoking cigarettes, and telling stories. It was getting late. Then someone brought up the tale of the teenagers. 5 or 6 years previous, 3 teens had taken a boat without permission and broken one of the cardinal rules of Tokelauan society. They'd ventured into the open ocean without the escort of a tautai, a master fisherman. The ocean is an unpredictable and occasionally violent place, and the title of tautai, bestowed by the island's elders, is equivalent to a driver's license. Even tautais do not venture far offshore. The isolation of Atafu can at times be difficult to bear. Philo stated Atafu felt like a prison. The desire to escape can become overwhelming. And as a plastic jug of vodka was passed around, the old story soon morphed into a new idea. By the time the jug was finished, the idea had become a plan. And so, almost on a whim, when the plans became serious, when Samu announced he'd be willing to steal his uncle's new boat, and most everyone in the clubhouse began backpedaling from their bluster, Etweni spoke up. He said he was in. Philo, Samu, and Etweni fanned out across the village. Their first mission was to find gasoline, and they soon collected about 20 gallons in 5 plastic jerry cans. They stashed the stolen gas in Samu's uncle's boat, a silver-colored Froza, made in New Zealand, with a 15-horsepower Yamaha engine. There was nothing fancy about it. A couple of unpainted wooden benches, a tiny storage space in the bow that could keep a few things dry. The only items inside were a small machete and a wooden mallet used to club fish. Its freeboard, the distance between the water and the top of the boat's sides, was just 16 inches, enough to repel only the smallest of waves. The boat's best feature was not visible. Inside the hull were 3 large air-filled aluminum cylinders, pontoons that made the craft exceptionally stable. After loading the gas, the boys again separated, dashing the short distance from the dock to the village. Philo sneaked into his house and grabbed a green tarpaulin, a large plastic sack containing 20 coconuts, a white ceramic teacup, 2 packs of Pall Mall cigarettes, and another jug of vodka, still sealed. From his refrigerator, he took 2 bottles of milk and a Kraft mayonnaise jar filled with water. Samu, meanwhile, climbed a tree and knocked down 9 more coconuts. Etwani had been instructed to find fishing equipment, but he was concerned that he'd wake someone up and get caught. So there was no fishing gear. The boys boarded the boat. To steel their resolve, they opened the vodka, poured it in the teacup, added a bit of water, and passed it around. This time, Etwani joined in. Samu started the engine. It was the final chance to run home, to sleep in a bed. Etwani later admitted that as he sat in the boat, he'd thought that this was a dangerous and stupid idea. "I almost jumped off," he says. But then Philo began yelling, and Samu and Etwani joined in. A rebel yell, a primal scream, a howl that tried to both express and eclipses their nervous, excited joy. They soon began shouting people's names, those they'd stolen from. They teased Samu's uncle. "Ha ha, we're leaving, we stole your boat." And they motored through the gap in the reef surrounding Atafu. It was the first time any of the boys had been on the ocean side of Tokelau without a master fisherman. Their plan was to reach the next atoll. They figured it would take 3 or 4 days. They had only the clothes they wore, shorts and t-shirts and sandals. They continued drinking. Etwani was bartender, water and vodka, in their 1 teacup. Philo was the first to tire out. He curled up on the bottom of the boat. Samu and Etwani stayed up, still drinking. Somehow, in his insobriety, Etwani took off his shirt and lost it overboard. Samu controlled the engine. "We just had an idea of following 1 star, says Etwani. "But we didn't know what star it was." Then Samu too grew sleepy. So Etwani drove for a while. Eventually he switched off the engine. And soon all 3 boys were passed out on the flat metal bottom of the boat. Etwani woke first, to the noise of a couple of dozen seagulls flying around. He could no longer see land. The bright sun, he realized, eliminated the idea of following 1 star. Philo was next up. He immediately vomited over the side. Then Samu awoke and he too threw up. They began cracking coconuts, banging them against the rail of the boat, drinking the liquid and chucking them away. They didn't even bother scraping out the coconut meat. Then they finished both bottles of milk. They broke out the cigarettes. Only 6 were dry. They smoked them. They ran the engine intermittently. It was a warm and overcast day. Their new idea was to follow the seagulls. The birds would naturally head back to land. But the birds seemed to be flying randomly, maybe in big circles. As the afternoon wore on, they grew a little hungry. They wondered what people were saying about them back on Atafu. Eventually, the sun set. "We were still in a good mood," says Philo, "not that hungry." They slept again in a puddle on the bottom of the boat. The next day, they saw an airplane. It was flying low, and they figured it was looking for them. Etwani waved, and the other 2 boys immediately teased him for wanting to be rescued so soon, so he stopped waving. Philo and Samu didn't think 2 days was enough to seem heroic. They figured as the plane flew away that it would eventually be back. Back on Atafu, a town meeting was called to discuss the disappearance of the boys. The prevalent feeling was, "Oh no, not again." The island was still recovering from a tragedy 8 months earlier, in February of 2010, when 3 men on a barge were caught in a storm. Their boat capsized. The bodies washed ashore, and now 3 more were missing. The forecast was for stormy weather. Help was requested from the Royal New Zealand Air Force. It swiftly sent out a P-3 Orion military surveillance plane with radar capable of detecting something as tiny as a submarine periscope. The total search area was more than 8,500 square miles. The plane searched 3 separate times, returning once to Samoa to refuel, for a total of 8 hours. At this point, approaching the 3rd night with no idea where they were, their supplies pitifully meager. You might think that panic would have set in, but they had not. They were sure someone would soon rescue them. On the next day, they finished the mayonnaise container of water and continued drinking the coconuts, this time making sure to scrape the insides. By that evening, they had used up all the gas. They could now only drift with the current. They threw all the fuel containers overboard. When they went to sleep, they had exactly 11 coconuts left. Their sleep was fitful and wet. The wind picked up. Etueni, who'd lost his shirt the first night, was especially cold. In the morning, there was still nothing but water all around them. No rescue boat, no airplane. Etueni finally said it. "Shouldn't we be found by now?" The response from the others? "They laughed at me," Etueni says. Their mouths grew very dry. Despite storm forecasts, it had not rained at all during the trip, and the only edible items were coconuts. That day, they each drank and ate too, an extravagant use of their supplies, yet it wasn't nearly enough to slake their thirst or satiate their hunger. By the time they went to sleep that night, they had precisely 5 coconuts left. At sunrise on the 5th day, the day the teens who had previously stolen a boat had been rescued, the boys all finally admitted aloud that they'd like to go back, that they wished they were home. Day 6, the 3 were well aware that they'd made a terrible mistake. Soon they were down to their last coconut. Thirst was like a hand around their throats. "That's when we started thinking about drinking seawater," says Etueni. Philo warned them that this was a bad idea. The next morning, Samu, the lifelong Tokelauan, announced, "I'm drinking it," and dipped the teacup into the ocean. He started sipping. "Then I got sick of looking at Samu drinking it," says Etueni. "Me too," says Philo. They all drank seawater together. Finally, more than a week into the trip, it rained. And for the first time, the boys used the green tarp. They took it out and spread it open in order to catch rainwater. Samu, Philo, and Etueni saw plenty of fish. The shadow of the drifting dinghy created a kind of artificial reef that attracted many small fish, which in turn enticed larger ones. There were also the ever-circling birds, who dive for fish during the day and sleep bobbing on the water at night. All the food the boys needed was visible to them, yet just out of reach. For a while, Etueni tried fishing with his hand, just holding it in the water over the side of the boat. He says he actually felt fish, but could never grab them. Through sheer happenstance, the boys did actually catch a few fish. The chief disadvantage of the low-sided boat was that seawater continuously splashed in. A wave of any size would break over the gunwales. Bailing during the day, using the mayonnaise jar, was constant, and at night the boat slowly filled up. But every so often, a total of 4 times during the trip, the waves carried along a fish that would flop into the boat. All of their skin soon grew torturously itchy rashes. The boys have dark, latte-colored skin, but the sun still overwhelmed them, igniting severe burns. About 2 weeks in, they began bickering. By this point, the boys were starving. "It's like your stomach is being ripped apart," says Etueni. Of course they weren't in good moods. "We got angry easily," says Etueni. They had nothing to divert themselves. They lost track of how many days they'd been gone. The disk of the sun slowly traveled overhead. In rough weather, they rode the great ocean swells, rising and falling sometimes 30 feet or more, as if the sea were breathing. The horizon was naked, save for the incessant waves that formed a swaying divide between ocean and sky. Later on, a storm blew in. It rained for 2.5 days, the only major storm the boys encountered. They couldn't bail fast enough. Water rose to the benches. They shivered violently. Rain, even in the tropics, comes in cold. So they wrapped themselves under the tarp, sitting cross-legged. From outside the boat, they would have looked like a small green haystack. It was warm in there, so despite the boat filling up and in danger of sinking, they sat for an entire day, huddled naked, rain hammering down, thrashed by winds. They say they felt like a team at this moment, dependent on one another, helping one another. Just the 3 of them, in a tiny boat, amid an endless sea. A few nights later, they spotted a ship. It was a large one, the deck outlined in orange lights. They hadn't seen a boat since leaving Tokelau. It was difficult to tell how far away it was. They thought, "Let's make a sail and catch up." So they held up the tarpaulin and tried to harness the wind. But it was exhausting work. So they debated whether to jump in the water and swim for it. Should only Samu go? Should they all go? They couldn't decide, and the boat motored away. They felt terrible. They wondered if that was their only chance, if they'd die before seeing another ship. They thought about all the food on that boat, the warmth, the beds. They blamed one another for not jumping in the water and at least making an active attempt at saving their lives. Now all they could do was sit in their dinghy and wait. Soon after the ship passed, Etweni quit. He stopped talking. He curled up in the bow. He didn't even sit up. He just lay all day in the bottom of the boat, mute, mostly unmoving, eyes half-lidded. He did this for weeks. Deep in his silent stage, pondering suicide, Etweni was alone, confined to the bow of the boat. One afternoon, a bird, one of the gray gulls that hung around the dinghy, landed on the boat. The boys were half comatose. They stared at the bird. A few days later, another bird came. It was just after a big rainstorm, and there was water in the tarp. This time, Samu tried to catch it. He was stealthy. He crouched low and grabbed the bird by the neck. They ate a bite of raw meat, but even in their hunger, it was worse than yuck. So they dried the carcass in the sun, and it was good. Afterwards, says Etweni, we wanted more. They drank the water in the tarp. The sea was so calm that waves didn't splash into the dinghy. Etweni ended his silence. The bird finally helped, he says, and I started talking. It was a good day. We were friends again, says Etweni. We were happy that day. But no more birds ever landed on the boat. The relief provided by those few bites of meat did not last long. It only served to reawaken their hunger pangs, their long, dormant stomachs gurgling with digestive juices. But there was nothing more. Soon they were hungrier than ever. The sun continued to beat down. The sea stretched all around, limitless and cruel. At times, Samu and Philo spent a few minutes bobbing in the water to cool off, but Etweni felt too frail to leave the dinghy. During one of these dips, the boys found barnacles on the bottom of the boat. Samu was the first to eat them. They were better than not eating. They gave some to Etweni. Then, during one swim, Philo let go of the boat, trying to snap off a barnacle. The current was strong, and he drifted away. He was too weak to catch up, but Samu held the dinghy in one hand and swam with the other, tugging the boat. It was an incredible feat, considering his condition. He managed to swim fast enough to reach Philo. He grabbed his hand. He helped haul him into the boat. That was the last time anyone went swimming. They were crazed with hunger, desperate beyond any measure. Their bodies were rotting before their eyes. Starvation lowered their internal temperatures, and they were colder than ever at night. Their bodies had used up all their fat. It was working on their muscles. Their minds would go next. They ate some of the hair that fell off their heads. They ate bits of their fingernails. They were dying. And then the rash on Philo's skin reached the point of excruciation. He was under the tarp in the middle of the night and felt what he described as an electric shock across his body. He leapt up. He screamed, "God, please help! Take this pain away!" He yelled louder, "God, please forgive me!" He wanted to tear off his skin. He couldn't stand it any longer. He was finished. He grabbed the machete. He begged Samu to kill him. Stab me, he begged Etweni. I felt like I was burning. I'd rather die than endure the pain. I was screaming at them to stab me. I was serious. Both boys refused. How are you going to see your parents? Samu asked. Eventually, the pain subsided. Exhaustion gripped him, and so they prepared to die. They stopped bailing. It was too much effort. Etweni got sick. He vomited repeatedly, but little came out. It stopped raining. They drank seawater. We all quit, says Etweni, like it makes no difference if we die or live. They were all lying about in the bottom of the boat in the most weakened possible state, covered by the tarp, close to death. And then Samu pulled himself up for a moment to see if rain clouds were coming. And he said one word. He said, "Yes." And he raised his arm and started waving. "Boys," he said, "I can see a boat." Etweni and Philo didn't believe him. A few times before, he had pretended to spot a boat, and when the others looked, he'd laugh. No one else thought it was funny. So they made him promise he wouldn't do it again. Now they thought he was joking once more. "Boys," Samu said again, "get up." There was something in his voice. Philo and Etweni got up, and there, directly in front of them, was a ship, the San Nicanao. I started waving, but I could only lift my arm for a few seconds, says Etweni. I wondered if it was a dream. They feared the ship would pass by. It didn't seem to be stopping. But then, from way above, the ship's navigator, Ty Fredrickson, called out. He asked if they needed help. The boys screamed, yes, and the ship lowered a small rescue boat. Fredrickson snapped a photo. It is an extraordinary and heartbreaking image. 3 naked boys, staring at their rescuer, reduced to skin and bones. Philo and Samu started crying, but Etweni didn't. He was too dehydrated. I couldn't cry, he says. I had no more tears. They had floated some 750 miles. They'd been gone more than 7 weeks. With help, they were too weak to walk. They boarded the San Nikunao. Their dinghy and its engine were also saved, to be returned to Tokelau. They sat in the galley, bewildered and overwhelmed by the scent of food. Fredrickson gave them some electrolyte drink and a bit of bread. Etweni ate an apple, but it made him sick, and he vomited into a bowl in the kitchen. They showered. They borrowed clothes. Samu made the first phone call. He called his grandmother. There were celebrations across Tokelau. The boys all slept that night in one bed, in Fredrickson's berth. At the Colonial War Memorial Hospital in Fiji's capital, Suva, the boys were treated for extreme dehydration, fungal infections, and second-degree burns. They were anemic. They had elevated heart rates, gross muscle wasting, and widespread infections. Etweni lost 2 teeth. Leanne Pierce, Tokelau's director of health, says they would likely not have survived another week. They spent a few days in the hospital, then flew to Samoa, where they moved in with a Tokelauan family to rest and recuperate. Samu, who had never before left Tokelau, came down with the chicken pox. Finally, just after Christmas, they were cleared to take the long ferry ride back to Atafu. They made it back to Atafu, where there was a big welcome feast. Samu gave a speech in which he apologized for their actions. Everyone says that God's got things in store for us. They could feel it. Atafu was too small for them. There was too much water everywhere they looked. All that suffering had just brought them back to the place they nearly killed themselves trying to escape. Within 2 months of returning home, they all left Atafu. Philo and Samu went with their families to Australia. Etweni moved with his family to Hawaii. None of them know if they'll ever go back. For the Kim family, their Pacific Northwest road trip would be a nightmare. The Kim family decided to spend Thanksgiving of 2006 with some of their family in Seattle. While this trip was for family time and fun, it also served another purpose. The Kim family had been looking for a new place to live, and they thought Seattle would be a good fit. They spent the holiday with their family, and then, on November 24th, 2006, they began their drive home. The family made a quick stop in Portland so that Katie could have lunch with one of her friends. They spent the night in a hotel. The original plan was for the family to drive back to their home in San Francisco, California. Katie suggested that they stay in Portland for part of the day, drive halfway home, and then stay somewhere else for the night, instead of driving all day. James thought it was a good idea too, and they pulled out a road map. They found a nice spot for them to stop that was right between where they were and their home. They decided to stay at the Tututun Lodge on the Oregon coast, located near Gold Beach. The Kim family left Portland later that afternoon and began driving south. At about 9 p.m., the family grew hungry and pulled off the road for late dinner at a Denny's in Roseburg, Oregon. The Kims decided that taking Highway 42, an exit not far from the restaurant, would be the best route to reach the Oregon coast. From this restaurant to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. When they were about 2 hours into their drive, James realized that he had missed their turn. They pulled over and looked at a map. They began looking on the map for an alternative route, and they believed that they had found one. The road they had found was called Bear Camp Road, but the map couldn't have warned them of how dangerous this road was. There was a sign posted just before the road that read, "Danger, remote road system ahead. Danger, you could get stranded and die." Bear Camp Road is oft-driven in summer, but potentially treacherous in winter. More than a decade earlier, the same road had claimed the life of an RV salesman from Montana named DeWitt Finley, who starved to death after getting stuck in 1994. When they hit the fork in the road at milepost 12, where Bear Camp looks more like the side route, they started seeing snowfall, which may have contributed to their decision to take the unfortunate route, BLM Road 34836. In winter, the Forest Service does not close Bear Camp Road because it is a popular recreation area for hunters, snowmobilers, and people seeking Christmas trees. Most winter road use comes from local residents, and those drivers are better prepared for the conditions. Terry Stone tried to warn the couple about driving to the coast at night with 2 young children. When Katie called to make reservations, I asked them where they were. I knew that they had young children with them and would be better to find something right off the highway. It seemed like too much to get to the lodge at that late hour, she said, but James was determined to stay at the lodge. Call the innkeeper back and tell her there was nothing more I wanted than to wake up at her lodge, James said. Katie called Stone back and she reserved a room for the Kims. If you're not prepared for what's ahead of you, it can be bone-rattling and frightening. It's a long, windy mountain pass. Even in the best of times, it's very treacherous, Terry said. Had informed Stone on which route they were taking, she would have advised against it. Never do we recommend the Bear Camp Road to get to the lodge, or do anyone I know of suggest to anyone to go that way, she said. The road started at 900 feet or 275 meters of elevation, but very quickly inclined to 4,000 feet or 1,220 meters. On the other side of the mountain was the lodge in Gold Beach. The road was paved, but it was incredibly narrow, with many steep drop-offs and no guardrails. The road was not plowed or maintained in the winter and was only meant to be driven during the summer. The road was very isolated, and if you had car troubles on the road, you were on your own. All of a sudden, we're driving in snow, and that is when we started to get very concerned, Katie Kim said. Her concerns were warranted. In fact, she should have been terrified. They missed another crucial turnoff that would have led them to safety. They veered off to a dangerous, narrow logging road that should have been closed. They were now headed down a road into the depths of the Oregon wilderness that had been abandoned for the winter. The road became more rugged and snow was piling up on the road. Their Subaru was now traversing over snowy, rocky terrain. It was very scary at that point, and I said, "James, this isn't right," Katie said. James had the windshield wipers on full power, and he was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Even with the wipers, it was nearly impossible to see outside. James drove for several more miles in horrible conditions. Sometimes the road was so clustered with rocks and tree branches that James had to put the car in park and get out to clear the road. She tried to call 911 but had no service. Katie finally tells James they needed to reverse the car and go back out the way they came in. James agreed, and for hours James drove the car in reverse through the narrow and winding road with steep drop-offs on one side. He had to open the car door to see the road better. Finally, they returned to a fork in the road that they had seen hours before and decided it was too unsafe to drive any further. Plus, James was exhausted and believed it was best to sleep for the night and evaluate the situation in the morning. They left the car on for warmth. When they woke up, they were faced with a dilemma with a 3-way fork. Katie and James looked over the map and tried to assess where they were. They could have gone back on the road that they had originally driven, which they knew was terrible and unsafe, or they could try to turn left and go down the mountain. The road to the left looked much wider than the roads they had been on, but there were no signs for this road. Ultimately, they decided to stay put and believed being stranded at a fork in the road would increase the likelihood of being found. The Kims found themselves stranded in a foreign environment: mountains, remote canyons, and logging roads that led to nowhere. They had seen a snowplow at the entrance to Bear Camp Road and believed that a snowplow must come through to plow the road regularly. The family stayed inside the car that day, eating snacks and playing games. They waited to be rescued, but no one came that day. By the end of that night on Sunday, they started to convince themselves that the plows must not have come through on the weekends, and that they just needed to wait for the following morning. On Monday, James and Katie tried their best to keep their spirits high for the kids. They played games, read stories to their daughters, and ate more snacks. They periodically honked their horn just in case anyone came close enough to hear them. By Monday night, James and Katie were getting very worried. They were almost out of food, and in order to keep the kids well fed, Katie began to breastfeed both of her daughters. It was this night when they heard something rumbling in the bushes. Petrified, Katie looks out of the window and spots a bear lurking in the foliage. James honks the horn to scare them away, but it didn't seem to work. Tuesday morning rolled around and they were still stranded. Food was getting dangerously low. James went out of the car and dug through bear droppings to find berries for his family to eat. They ate some of the berries, but decided to stop just in case the berries would poison them. The daughters had been acting out the day before but stopped on Tuesday. They were scared and lethargic. They kept to themselves and seemed to just shut down. On Wednesday morning, the family ran out of gas. They no longer had a way to heat themselves, and the car grew very cold. It was so very cold we couldn't sleep because our bones ached, Katie said. If they won't come to rescue us, maybe they would come to rescue the forest, James said. James took off one of the tires in an attempt to light it and cause a fire. Getting the tire to burn was a long and exhausting struggle. The smoke wouldn't rise above the trees. He threw whatever he could into the fire to fuel it. They succeeded in increasing the flame, and the black smoke rose above trees. The family was elated and finally had a semblance of hope. But elation was short-lived as they heard a plane above, but it didn't spot them. Later that night, the bears returned. The family could hear bears again. They were sniffing and moaning, walking around the car. And for the first time, they thought that they might not survive the night. Back in their hometown of San Francisco, a family friend noticed that they had not returned yet. The family was supposed to come home on Monday, but now it was Wednesday. This friend went to the police to report them missing, and a search party was being put together. Of course, the Kim family would have had no way of knowing that. James Kim's father also got involved in the search. He hired Carson helicopters based in Merlin to join the search. As details of the missing family became known, media descended on Southwest Oregon, as the story of the disappearance of the Kim family made national news. When word got out 3 days later, the initial search area was huge. Much of Southwest Oregon, recalled Phil Turnbull, chief for Rural Metro Fire Department. But it slowly narrowed as details trickled out, including a cell phone ping discovered by Edge Wireless engineers from a tower near Glendale. They plotted a wedge shape to the west that covered the Bear Camp Road area, but it also covered areas north of the Rogue River, and a week had already passed since the Kims had become stranded. Turnbull was a search and rescue volunteer and planning section chief in the Kim search. He'd seen plenty of searches, but this one was different, with officials from around the state and national media attention. All of a sudden, there was a lot of brass in that room, Turnbull said this week. We had CNN satellite rigs parked outside the command post. This was a little bit of a circus, he said. On Thursday morning, James and Katie began to accept the real possibility that they might die. They began to plan for the worst. James had been studying the road map to see if he could brave the snow and seek help. He found a town that he believed was only 4 miles away called Galice. James told Katie that he believed he could get to the town in a matter of hours and ask for help. Katie agreed to let him go, thinking that it was the only option that they had. On December 2nd, James left the car in just tennis shoes and a light jacket. It was much scarier without him there. We were really alone, just myself and 2 little babies. I was terrified, Katie said, but she believed in James. He has never let her down. James started down the road for hours and eventually decided to follow a river, thinking that it might lead to Gallus or another town. After walking for far too long, James began to think that he had either taken a wrong turn or that he had underestimated how far the town actually was. As darkness crept over the Kims, she knew something was wrong. It turned dark, and I realized we had a problem. It was 11 and he still had not returned. It was so cold and couldn't imagine what it would be like outside of the car. I start thinking he's probably not coming back, she said. 2 days passed and James did not return. Katie feared for the worst. She decided her only chance was the hike out as well. So Katie, with her 2 young girls, begins their trek into the wilderness. 2 hours in, because she was severely dehydrated, she started to hallucinate. Even in her weakened mental state, she heard helicopters toward where the car was. They turned around back to the car. I heard aircraft approaching and tried to signal for them. I was so physically exhausted and depressed. I felt like there wasn't much hope anymore. Just when she lost all hope, Katie Kim was finally spotted. It was Private Pilot John Raker of Central Point who finally connected the dots. Raker, who owned 11 Burger Kings in Southern Oregon before becoming a Jackson County commissioner in 2008, had flown over the search area many times on the way to his cabin near Agnes. He read about the Kims in the newspaper and got in his helicopter at about the same time that hordes of searchers were focusing on the Bear Camp Road area. He knew well the long, winding road that descended toward Black Bar Lodge and beyond, into the Rogue River's wild canyon. He knew there were actually several roads and played a hunch. He got within a mile of the Kim's car the first day, then on the second day, went back. I was following bear prints, which are round, and I saw these long, thin ones, Rayshore remembered. I could hover within 10 feet. I could see treads. I knew they were fresh. He lost those prints, evidently made by James Kim. But at some point, he looked down to see a woman waving an umbrella, jumping up and down with children nearby. Raker couldn't land, but soon a Crowman S-61 dropped survival gear, and another pilot was able to land within 200 yards of the Kim's Saab. Within a half hour, Katie and the girls landed at the Grants Pass Airport in Merlin. By then, they had been stranded for 9 days. James had torn off pieces of his clothes as he walked through the snow. It is believed he was doing this so that he could find his way back, or so that someone could find him if necessary. Another theory would say that he was tearing off his clothes because he was getting too hot, which is a symptom of hypothermia. When Katie and her children were rescued, she first believed it was because James had gotten to the town and told rescuers to come and get them. But to her horror, she discovered that James had never made it to the town. He'd eaten little for more than a week. Although he had a warm jacket, he had no hat. He ended up walking more than 20 miles. He had no chance once he descended into the canyon. He was probably dead before his family was rescued. James's body was found on December 6th at noon. He was discovered in Big Windy Creek, laying on his back in 2 feet of icy water. He was wearing the rest of his clothes and was identified by the papers that he was carrying with him in his backpack. His body was sent in to be examined, and an autopsy report revealed that he had died of hypothermia. It was estimated that James had died 2 days after leaving the safety of his car. Joe Hyatt, now the fire marshal for Grants Pass Fire and Rescue, led the team that went into Big Windy after Kim's footprints were spotted turning off of a logging road. He described how team members got a strong feel for James Kim's final hours by descending the harsh canyon, full of fallen trees, snow, and sheer canyon walls. Hyatt said the young father made the ultimate sacrifice. The only way we could proceed down that canyon was to be in the water in our dry suits, Hyatt said. I drew on every ounce of my experience taking my team into that canyon. We talked about what he must have gone through. In 2009, Katie, Kim, and the girls made a surprise, emotional appearance at Josephine County Search and Rescue's Christmas banquet. That was shortly after she rode with Raycor and Sarah Rubrecht, rescue coordinator during the ordeal, to the site of their stranding, where 3 years earlier she breastfed her girls to keep them alive, and where the family burned tires to stay warm after their car ran out of gas. The route to and along Bear Camp Road has other signs that have been erected since the incident to help drivers avoid the fate of the Kim family. In an opinion piece in the Washington Post a year after his son's death, James's dad, Spencer Kim, criticized the local authorities who conducted the search, the legal barriers to procuring crucial credit card and phone use information in a timely way, interference from the national media, and the gate leading to the desolate logging road was left unlocked. If the gate had been properly signed and locked, he argued, his son would never have driven 21 miles down the road. Several days before Kim's article, Senator Dianne Feinstein from California sent a letter to Interior Secretary Dirk Kempthorne, complaining about the gate and demanding an investigation. But even if the search and rescue effort had been flawless, the results might not have changed. The disappearance of the Kim family and the untimely death of James Kim is not really about an unlocked gate, nor is it about credit cards or the purported shortcomings of any member of the search parties that tried to rescue the family. Every winter in the high mountains of the United States brings new stories of travelers who take wrong turns, skiers who wander off groomed slopes, and snowmobilers who run out of gas miles from civilization. In an era of cell phones and GPS, it's hard for those inexperienced in the wild to understand that it is still possible to get well and truly lost. It is still possible to be overwhelmed by the forces of nature, and there is not yet any foolproof remedy for human error and a lack of luck. Since the tragedy, county authorities in the area have made dramatic improvements. Perhaps the most important outcome is the creation of CORSAR, California-Oregon Regional Search and Rescue. 8 local counties now work together and share resources on search operations. They also gather in the summer for training. Search and rescue is 1,000,000 times better than it was in 2006 because of relationships, sharing of resources, and cross-training, Sarah Rubrecht said. Despite the circumstances that led to the tragedy, James Kim's heartbreaking effort to save his family while famished, freezing, and exhausted left an impression. James Kim put himself through a desperate ordeal, climbing down a ravine over boulders and logs, through the nearly impenetrable brush, and in and out of an icy creek, in what one rescue leader called a superhuman effort to save his family. It was amazing what he went through to get as far as he did, said Hyatt. It proved the love he had for his family. For Rick Magee, his Outback experience would truly be an unforgettable nightmare. Ricky McGee, at the time, a 35-year-old, had been offered work in a government department in Port Hedland, Western Australia. He accepted the job and set off on the long drive, which he had made multiple times before. Driving a 2001 Mitsubishi Challenger, he took the Buntine Highway, which for much of his journey was a desert track across the outback of the Northern Territory. Because he had a couple of days before starting his new job, he wanted to visit an old mate, so decided to take a detour and drive to Halls Creek, where his friend resided. He turned left off the Stewart Highway near Dunmara, about 300 miles south of Darwin, and hit the dirt of the Buchanan Highway heading towards Top Springs. By taking the shortcut, he was confident he'd make it to Halls Creek before dusk. The road was not much more than a goat track and had its fair share of potholes, but it saved a couple of hours not sticking to the highway. Hours later, he came across some stranded Aboriginal people. They flagged him over next to their broken-down Kingswood. Not many vehicles travel the Buntine in January because it's mostly dirt, and the road can get washed out in the wet season. He knew if he drove past them, they'd be waiting in the sun for a while. He pulled up a safe distance in front of the Kingswood and indicated for one of them to come and explain what they needed. All the doors of his car were locked, and the windows wound up except for the front seat passenger side. He wanted to have his bases covered if they tried anything. There would be no opportunity to punch him if he hit the gas. He also had his machete. The stranded man explained they'd run out of fuel and needed a lift to Halls Creek. He indicated for him to get in. He gave him a cold beer and they were off. About 20 minutes in, across the top edge of the western desert, he was out of beer. The passenger cracked another one and opened it for him. That was the only time I took my eyes off my drink for the entire trip, Ricky said. After 10 minutes, he began to feel groggy. His vision had warped. It wasn't as if this was the first time he'd ever had a few cans driving through nowhere, but it had never come to this. They were only a couple of hours away from Halls Creek. He kept driving despite the feeling, but he couldn't shake the feeling of incredible lethargy. Meanwhile, his silent passenger sat back and cracked himself another can. He didn't seem concerned at all by the reckless swerving across the road. Ricky Magee doesn't remember anything much after that. When Ricky opened his eyes, he was sitting in the front passenger seat of his car. What was going on? The car wasn't moving. When I raised my head, I could see it was parked on the side of a dirt highway, he said. He gets out of the car to have a look around. He heard some voices that were coming from behind some bushes. As he approached, the voices dropped. Groggily, he turned to walk back to the car and got in the driver's seat and was about to hit the gas when he saw a figure out of the corner of his eye. In a flash, the man jumped from the shadows and onto the footstools on the back of the car. He floors it down the dirt highway, trying to shake the figure off the rear, but he had a spider-like grip and didn't budge. Using a rock, he smashed the back window of Ricky's car vehicle to force his way in. The next thing Ricky knew, they were fighting while bumping along the dirt highway at well over 60 miles per hour. Then they slammed into some bushes on the side of the road. Ricky got out gingerly and disoriented. He looks and sees the figure running off into the darkness. Hours later, Maggie is sitting on the side of the road, disoriented, trying to come to grips with what is happening, when he sees people rummaging through his car, looking for anything of value. Soon, a young Aboriginal man comes over with a bottle of booze, telling Ricky not to say anything. With nothing to lose, Ricky takes a swig and again passes out. When he regained consciousness, he was in a hole covered in black plastic with some rocks and dirt thrown on top. Something was spread over my face. Sand. I wiggled my toes, no shoes. I struggled to move, felt my pockets for my lighter, nothing. Cigarettes gone. Where was I? I had no clue. Something was pushing through the tarp, the sound of sniffing, dogs maybe. I wriggled and pushed myself up, forcing back the cover, into daylight and heat. Now I was face to face with a pack of dingoes, ready to sit down to dinner, Ricky said. Only the attempts by 4 dingoes to claw him woke him up. In the middle of the desert, baking in the hot sun, confusion overtook him as he tried to understand what had happened. He was left for dead. He sat down in the shade for hours, pondering his predicament. Nobody in sight. No roads, no houses, no water, nothing. Just desert. To get more familiar with his surroundings, he climbed a tree and scanned the horizon. I was a completely different landscape from where I had been the day before, or however many days it had been since being robbed. The country was a lot more barren, leaving me with the impression I was even more isolated. I was lost, I was hungry, I was thirsty. I was still feeling the effects of whatever it was I'd been drugged with during what I assumed was the past 2 days. It was hot, and no one, besides the arseholes who'd left me there for dead, had the slightest clue where to start looking for me, Ricky said. After getting his bearings from the sun, he figured due west was the best direction to find civilization. Hours into his trek, it occurred to him that he was probably walking further into the desolate interior, so he turned back east, in the hope of stumbling across a road or a river leading towards a homestead. He couldn't see any roads, so he headed for a big rise on the horizon to get a better view. When he reached the rise, all he saw was scrub and bare earth. Now he was getting extremely thirsty. With no water source anywhere close, he started to contemplate the unthinkable. If you have to drink urine, I suggest you let it cool down first. It doesn't taste very nice, Ricky said. Trekking barefoot, his feet were already starting to sore and bleed. The sun started to set, and now it was getting cold. There wasn't much time in the comfort zone between the two extremes. All Ricky wanted to do was keep walking, find a road, and get out of this situation. When it got too dark, he nestled next to some foliage, trying to get some sleep. By midnight, it started raining. The replenishment of the water was an incredible relief. He cupped his hands and gulped down as much as he could. For the next few days, Ricky Miggy wandered through the desert, chasing potential rain clouds and drinking his urine. Still no roads in sight. He kept falling over as the weight of dehydration pulled him down. His main priority at this point was to find a water source. He staggered through some sparse scrub for a few more miles, before finding the first sign of water, which was wet mud. He managed a few precious drops scraped out of the ground. Then he continued walking. He followed a trail of wet patches that soon turned into puddles, and the puddles to sloshy channels, eventually finding his way to the edge of a thriving river. It was an incredible feeling to see such a torrent of water carving its way through the desert. I couldn't believe my luck and wasted no time diving in to get my fill. A sea of salvation in the shape of a seasonal river flowing south. I praised the Lord, or whatever caused me to cross its path, he said. One minute, Ricky was on the verge of death by dehydration. The next, he was flapping about in the current of a river. If my luck kept running like that, I'd be eating hamburgers for dinner, he thought to himself. By now, Ricky Miggy assumed all of his troubles were solved. Fresh water, a cool respite from the heat, and a chance to move long distances without wearing out his banged-up feet. Unfortunately, things don't always work out so easily. He makes his way downstream, half wading, half swimming, and found this was not an easy passage. He had to dodge the trees and branches, debris, and wired fences buried under the water and carried by the fast-moving current. Then suddenly, around a bend, a windmill appeared. After 4 or 5 hours of struggling against the river, Ricky decided to camp at the windmill. He swam to the edge of the winding river and crawled out of the water, brimming with confidence. The breaks were finally going my way. Someone was bound to find me, he said. After a few days and a torrential rainstorm later, Ricky builds a shelter. While the rain provided essential hydration, food was scarce, with only grass as his primary source of nourishment. I'd consumed so much of the rain-saturated crap, but it did nothing to satisfy my growing hunger pains, he said, and it was cold at night. Originally, food wasn't a priority as rescue and water, but as the days dragged on, the hunger became too much to bear. It was clear no one was coming to Windmill to rescue him, and he had to find his own way out. He was able to use the boards from the windmill to make a raft. He made an SOS sign out of the windmill blades and an arrow in the direction he planned to travel. I had to take the risk. With no sign of being rescued, it was time to leave my fortress and float away, Miggy said. Ricky Miggy had been floating for hours when a path floated into view. He paddled over to the river edge and felt a sense of relief, that there were signs of life. He decided that he had to take the chance and follow the path, even if that meant leaving the sustainability of the river. Ricky gets off the raft and takes the gamble and starts his trek to follow the path. A couple of hours into the walk, he began to contemplate going back in search of the river again when he came across the main path. The countryside still resembled the sparsely vegetated dust bowl he'd been walking through since leaving the river, but it looked more promising. He walked for a few more miles before he stumbled on a fence that seemed like a real property fence, with red gates and a big sign on it. The sensation of setting eyes on a property sign that someone else had put there was one of pure amazement. All that walking had paid off. My heartache soothed instantly, Maggie said. He'd been stuck out there for a week already. Finally, it felt like he was getting closer to being found. There were a few calves and cows wandering the land, but at that stage, cow slaughtering remained a last resort, as it looked like too much effort, and still felt confident of being rescued. He continued down the path. Blood was pouring from his feet again. He was walking on an open sore, and dared not to take a look at them. He wrapped his feet in his shirt as extra padding. Pounding the dirt with temperatures climbing to a scorching 120 degrees, there was no escaping from the heat. As night fell, the chill of the darkness was freezing. He woke up and continued his trek down the road. When thirst was gripping him, Ricky got down on his knees and prayed for rain. Within 15 minutes, it was pissing down. I couldn't believe it. I don't know what it feels like to win the lottery, but I imagine it doesn't get much better than taking water on the back of your parched throat in those circumstances. Especially when you know it's the only thing in the whole world that will keep you alive for another day, he said. He'd been walking down the road for more than a day, without a hint of another human being. Then he came across an intersection that had two signs pointing east and west that read, Bori to the left and Wallamunga Yards to the right. Ricky was now in a dilemma. He chooses Wallamunga Yards. It was all downhill in the direction of Western Australia, and figured that the word yards was a good sign that some signs of life would be around. He walked a few miles and eventually arrived. Nothing but worn-out cattle yards and no signs of life. So he turned around back to the intersection. Now all of his energy was spent and needed to rest. He found shade and sat down as the hunger kept gnawing at him. So he went searching. He spotted a dead tree, hollow inside. Without hesitating, he stuck his hand inside, searching for any nourishment. Then he felt a pinch. Something latched onto his finger. When pulled out his arm, he saw a bush centipede had bitten him. He panicked as the pain raced up his arm and started swelling. He raced to the sign at the intersection and made a run to Bori. It couldn't be that far to this place, Bori. I'd die on this road otherwise. The dingoes will eat me. I've got to find a doctor, Ricky said. He's screaming in pain, running down the road. This is the first time he truly believed he was going to die from something other than exposure. The left side of his body throbbed as he ran down the path. The pain became blinding as the sun set. He didn't know what to do. Then he ran into a fence hidden by the darkness. He thought he saw car lights. He yelled, trying to chase it, believing this was his only hope. He couldn't go on anymore. He plopped down. Tears were running down his face as the venom was coursing through his body. Now the left side of his neck and face had swelled. He could feel the buildup of fluid choking him as he passes out. It was the raindrops that awoken him the next day. He realized his arm didn't sting and could feel his face. He was alive, but had gone completely off course and was more lost than ever. Now there was no sign of the Bori intersection or a path. With no substantial food in his stomach for the previous 10 days, the hunger pains grew worse as the pain of the centipede bite subsided. Eating grass and roots wasn't enough. He was now tired of the cold of the desert and constructed a shelter made of mud, grass, and cow manure. My cow shit mud barricade stood about 60 centimeters tall by the time I'd finished constructing it, and crawled inside for a much-needed sleep. The absurdity of smelling like a dirty cow's arse certainly wasn't lost on me, but I couldn't see the funny side anymore. Life had become a bad joke, frankly. I was getting eaten by mozzies and drinking muddy, shitty water to stay alive, lying in shit, rubbing it over my body. What the hell was I doing out here? Mr. Miggy said. For days, he survived in his hut, killing a couple of small lizards and consuming grass. The rest and the replenishment were much needed, and he knew he had to keep moving. After a rare good night's rest, Ricky Meggy moved on, thirst gripping him once again. He remembered once on a program on TV that a certain type of black rock meant there was water below the surface. He could see those same types of rocks and figured it was worth a shot to check out the bush survival theory for himself. He got up from his resting spot and walked a few hundred yards down to the bottom of a hill. He started digging furiously and then found muddy water. The deeper he dug, the clearer the water was. I buried my face into the pool that was filling up and tried to filter out the mud with my teeth as best I could. I couldn't help laughing at my new bush survival skills, Ricky said. With enough fluids to continue on, he wanted to find the source. He walked another half-mile down when came upon a big green mound nestled in the distance. As he made his way closer, he saw that not only was it a dam, but one so full it was overflowing. Days of drinking stagnant water, combined with his chopped-up feet from all the walking, was all the convincing he needed to settle at the dam for a few days to recuperate. This plan was especially confirmed when he realized the dam was surrounded by all types of vegetation. He could see frog holes and yabby tracks. The water in the dam felt as fresh as if God had personally filled it himself, and I splashed around, swimming from bank to bank, looking for a fill of vegetation. The healthy amount of food lining the edge of the dam meant I could just slide up while flapping in the water and take a sample, he said. In his enthusiasm, he managed to dig a hole for shelter that was comfortable enough for the first night. But the constant attack from mozzies, giant Australian mosquitoes, was constant throughout the ordeal and didn't let up at the watering hole. So he had to build a shelter if he was going to make this watering hole his home. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Mr. Meggie ate nearly everything he could find. Lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, and caterpillars. Anything that slithered, crawled, scurried, or crept across the desert floor was fair game. In fact, he developed an affinity for certain kinds of frogs over others. Leeches, he said, are okay, but you must eat them quickly, otherwise they attach to the inside of your mouth. But it hadn't rained much, and the dam was drying out quickly. He kept hearing planes in the distance, and it had become too much. Combined with the strength he built up from having a constant food source, water, and rest, it gave him the will to set out on one final bid for freedom. It was hard to leave the comfort of the dam, but Ricky was confident that he'd find another watering hole. The sun was burning his face and lips. Even the tops of his hands were getting torched. But as it was looking bleak, he spots a big green mound in the distance. Meggie hurries towards the mound. At last, he made it to the mound. Ricky located a big watering hole, which had 2 overflow dams lapping on either side. Crawling to the edge of the first overflow, he grabbed handfuls of bopples and shoved them down his mouth. After regaining some strength with food and water, he went on to work on another shelter, but this one would be different. There was timber next to the dam, sourced from the tall trees just a stone's throw away. Rick would work on this structure for days. Ricky McGee was dealing with the disappointment of not being rescued. He felt as if he was being ignored. It has been weeks now, and he was settling into a routine of building and reinforcing his shelter. It gave him a job to do to distract him from the loneliness and dwelling on his current situation. His mind wandered constantly. The frustration of seeing planes fly over consumed him. He became disillusioned about his prospects of being rescued and had run out of ideas to make someone notice him. As the days went by, his energy and food sources were depleting. His bones were poking out of his skin and his eyes sank into his skull. He'd lost so much weight, his calf and thigh muscle had virtually disappeared. Then, when it couldn't get any worse, he felt an unbearable pain in his mouth from a rotten tooth. Blisters inside his gums stretched from the back of his lips to the back of his throat, making it impossible to eat anything. With starvation already hovering, he knew he'd be dead soon if he couldn't eat. The pain was so excruciating he hadn't eaten in the last few days. He knew he had no other choice but to deal with the rotten tooth. He grabbed some wire he used to screw frogs with, stuck the wire inside his mouth, and shredded the skin inside his mouth. He popped the blisters, and his mouth filled with black blood and pus. He nearly threw up. Now that the blisters were gone, he could open his rotten tooth. He put a finger inside. He felt a tooth wiggling. It was now time to deal with it. With tears in his eyes, with the same piece of wire, he hooked it under the loose part of the tooth, and he used all his remaining strength to pull on the wire. A ripping sound echoed through his enclosure as the tooth detached. My rotten tooth was undoubtedly my worst experience. It was horrifying. What I had to do to extract that thing still sickens me when I think about it, Ricky says. But he was still in pain and eating was painful. He was able to consume small bopples, but nothing of significance as it was too painful to move his jaw. He was confined for 5 days in his shelter dealing with the tooth. When he tried to walk, he fell over. He took a swim the dam and was able to get his bearing about himself. It had been 71 days in the desert, living in a makeshift shelter on the side of an oasis in the middle of nowhere. By late afternoon, he was preparing for his daily food collection when he heard something resembling a motor. Rushing outside his shelter, he was met by the sight of a four-wheel drive, with 2 young guys up front, 2 jackaroos, or Australian ranch hands, who had been sent out from the nearest cattle station to perform their day's labor. Their first order of business required them to head into some of the most desolate parts of the country that surrounded them. In this part of the northern Outback, that meant going into some of the most isolated pockets on the continent. As they slowly worked their way across the expanse, they saw something moving off in the distance. It was something unfamiliar, something odd and foreign to the regular scenery. They drove closer to investigate. As they drew closer, their curiosity only grew as Ricky Meggie rose and fell in the distance. As they approached, the 2 wide-eyed jackaroos looked at each other in disbelief. The mysterious figure they had found appeared to be a walking, stumbling, living skeleton. I couldn't believe it. After all this time, I wasn't exactly sure, but I thought I'd been waiting for someone to come along for pretty close to 3 months. I had hardly absorbed this incredible twist in my fate before new thoughts began rushing through my racing brain, Ricky said. The jackaroos only stopped at the dam as an afterthought because they were in that corner of the station and didn't want to come back all this way in the furthest corner of the furthest paddock again for a while. Because of that decision, they found Mr. Meggie. He made the 45-minute ride to the homestead. The station nurse looked at him in horror. She saw this human being, just skin and bones, just days away from death. While he wanted some meat, the nurse explained that he had to be weaned back on solid food, so he had a bowl of fruit and pumpkin soup. After a good meal in his stomach, Ricky called his sister, who started crying at the sound of his voice. She didn't have the heart to tell their mother Ricky was missing. A day later, Ricky was on a plane to Darwin Hospital. During his rehab, Ricky described his insatiable hunger during his hospital stay. Later, the police interviewed Ricky about the events leading up to being left for dead in the Australian outback. The cops doubted his story, even though they found his car around where he was described. At this point, Ricky didn't care if the men that robbed him were brought to justice. The fact that I made it out alive, that was my payback to those guys, he said. To this day, many people doubt Ricky Meggie's story about how he ended up in the situation to be stranded in the Australian desert. He was fortunate to be stranded during a good wet season, as having water meant he wasn't going to die in days. For someone with virtually no bush experience, I think Ricky did remarkably well, his doctor said. Months after the ordeal, Ricky Meggie returned to the dam with a friend. As closure to the ordeal, many human beings wouldn't have survived. Ricky Meggie is a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He survived against all odds. I had plenty of opportunities to give up, but each time I found a way to hang on just long enough for someone to find me. What I lived through is probably more than most people will have to endure, but anyone can apply those same instincts I relied on to problems confronting them. As the old saying goes, whatever doesn't kill you can only make you stronger. Always remember that life is worth living and be prepared to fight for it with every ounce of your soul. You just never know what tomorrow might bring. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, where the elements conspire against you, and every step feels like a battle, you have faced a harrowing ordeal that would have tested the limits of even the strongest souls. Through the darkest nights and the fiercest storms, you clung to hope with an unyielding grip, proving that the human spirit is a force that can withstand the harshest of trials. In the face of adversity, you unearthed reservoirs of courage and determination within yourself that you might never have realized existed. Your journey through the wilderness was not just a physical feat, but a testament to the power of the mind to conquer doubt and fear. When the winds howled and the rain poured, you stood unshaken, your spirit a beacon of unwavering resolve. You navigated treacherous terrain, battled exhaustion, and stared down the unknown with a steely gaze. Your footsteps became a symphony of survival, each one echoing the strength of your spirit. And as you emerge from the wilderness, battered yet triumphant, you carry with you the lessons that only such an arduous journey could impart. You've learned that resilience is not just about enduring, but about thriving in the face of adversity. You've discovered that hope is not a fleeting emotion, but a flame that can illuminate even the darkest of paths. Your story is a testament to the human ability to adapt, grow, and transform hardships into stepping stones toward greatness. You've weathered the storm and emerged stronger, wiser, and more alive than ever before. Your journey stands as a beacon of inspiration to all who face their own trials, a reminder that within us all lies the power to endure, to overcome, and to rise. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay safe so you can avoid an outdoor disaster.